If rivers could talk, the Connecticut River would whisper the secrets of tribes, echo the footsteps of colonists, and murmur the cries of war. It shaped the land, and named a state. Before there were borders, before flags, before the first nail of the first colonial home was ever driven into wood, there was a river. A long, winding, whispering artery of life, carving its way through dense forests and quiet valleys. It did not belong to anyone, yet it fed everyone. Its name? Quinnehtukqut, not English, not French. Not written in any book brought over from Europe. It came from the Algonquian language, spoken by the people who had lived here for centuries. It meant, beside the long tidal river. Not, land of opportunity. Not, land of conquest. Just a quiet recognition of water and place. When the English arrived, they twisted the word to fit their tongues. Quinnehtukqut became Connecticut. A river's name, echoing through time. Stamped on laws, borders, and schools. But make no mistake. This wasn't just a name, it was a memory. A map. A promise made by the land itself. Because long before it became a state, before it even became a colony, it was home. To the people who lived along its banks, who didn't just name the river, they listened to it. And if you listen closely, you'll hear the stories they left behind. The land we now call Connecticut once echoed with the footsteps of nations. Nations without maps, but with memory. With tradition. With roots deeper than any colony would ever plant. The Mohegan. The Pequot. The Podunk. The Quinnipiac. The Shattuckuk. These weren't just tribes. They were civilizations. Each with their own language, their own stories, their own understanding of the stars above and the soil below. They moved with the seasons, not against them. They planted corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters, because they believed food should grow in harmony. They hunted deer and fished the great river, not for sport, but for survival. For ceremony. The river was not just a resource. It was a lifeline, a teacher, a spirit that pulsed beneath everything they did. They called it the long tidal river, not just because it stretched for hundreds of miles, but because it breathed, in and out, with the ocean, with the moon, with time itself, and it connected them. From the villages up in what's now Vermont, all the way down to where the river empties into the Atlantic, they followed its currents not to conquer, but to gather, to trade, to pray. Every bend of that river held meaning. A sacred place to meet, to mourn, to celebrate. But then the sails appeared. At first, the newcomers were strange, but not unwelcome. The Pequot and Mohegan saw opportunity, trade, alliance, maybe even peace. Beads, axes, kettles, muskets. New objects with unfamiliar power. And yet, behind those objects came something else. Diseases that crept silently into their villages, burning fevers, coughing children, entire families gone in days. And behind the sickness, came the taking. Land that had always been shared, was suddenly claimed. Paths that had always been open, were suddenly fenced. A river that had always spoken, now echoed with foreign voices, maps, and musket drills. Old alliances fractured under pressure, tensions sharpened like arrowheads. And then came the fire. In 1636, a trader was killed under suspicious circumstances. The English wanted retribution. They demanded the Pequot hand over those responsible, but diplomacy wasn't the goal. Domination was. And so in the spring of 1637, a war broke out. The Pequot War, one of the first recorded genocidal campaigns on American soil. English settlers, allied with the Mohegan and Narragansett, surrounded the Pequot village at Mystic. They waited until dawn. Then, they struck. What followed wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. Hundreds of Pequot, men, women, children, burned alive in their homes. Those who fled were hunted down, executed, enslaved. The Pequot people, once one of the most powerful in the region, were declared extinct by official colonial decree. But words on paper do not erase blood from the earth. And rivers remember. They carried the ashes, the silence, the screams, downstream, and they carried the guilt, too. Because even among the colonists, some looked back at what happened in Mystic with unease, with shame. What had begun as trade had turned to terror, and the river that had once connected two worlds, now separated them. For the Mohegan, who had sided with the English to preserve their own people, the aftermath was bitter. They had survived, but at what cost? What do you do when your ally becomes your ruler? When your land becomes a deed in someone else's hand? The river kept flowing, but everything else had changed. The villages were gone. The ceremonies silenced. The names, once spoken with reverence, faded into whispers, then into footnotes. And yet, they endured, in quiet corners of the state. In songs passed down, in stories told by firelight. In the faces of descendants who still walk these lands, still speak the old words, still honor the river. You won't find those stories carved into marble. They won't appear in textbooks without a fight. But they're here. In the soil. In the wind through the trees. In the quiet places by the water. And in the name we still say today, Connecticut. It may rest on street signs and letterheads now, but beneath it lies a truth older than the state, older than the country, older than the myth of manifest destiny. It lies in the river, in the loss, and in the legacy. Because after the river became sacred, after it became bloodied, it became something else entirely, and if you listen closely, you'll hear the stories they left behind. Before it was a state, before the first colonial charter, this land had keepers. The Mohegan, the Pequot, the Quinnipiac, the Podunk, the Shattuckuk. These weren't just tribes. They were nations, rich in language, spirituality, tradition. They didn't write with ink, but with memory. They didn't own the land, they belonged to it. And at the center of it all, the river. The long tidal river, Quinnehtukqut, wasn't just a landmark, it was life. It gave food, guided trade, marked the seasons. It was a spirit, breathing in rhythm with the moon. They lived beside it, not in dominance, but in reverence. The Mohegan followed its bends, mapping their lives to its currents. The Pequot honored it in ceremony, believing its waters carried the voices of their ancestors. From the hills in the north to the salt marshes in the south, the river was a thread that stitched together hundreds of villages. Not a dividing line, but a bond. Their calendars were the migration of birds. Their libraries were the minds of elders. Their classrooms were the fire, the forest, the river. And yet, this world was not immune to change. At first, when the ships came, with their square sails and iron tools, they were watched from the trees, not with fear, but with curiosity. The English settlers brought strange goods, metal pots, wool cloth, fire sticks. They wanted furs. The native peoples wanted peace. At first, there was trade, there was even trust, but it didn't last. The settlers saw land not as shared ground, but as property. Lines were drawn, agreements ignored. Treaties rewritten in ink the natives couldn't read. And with the traders came something else, a silent killer. Disease swept through the river valley like smoke through dry brush. Smallpox, influenza, measles. Whole villages gone within days. Thousands buried by their own kin, if there were any left to bury them. Still, the Mohegan and Pequot endured. They adjusted, adapted, negotiated. But pressure was mounting. In 1636, a trader named John Oldham was killed in a dispute. The English blamed the Pequot. They demanded retribution, not explanation. What followed wasn't justice, it was war. The Pequot War. The first of its kind in New England, brutal, swift, and unforgettable. The English allied with rival tribes, including the Mohegan and Narragansett, and turned a single spark into a wildfire. On May 26, 1637, English soldiers and their native allies surrounded the fortified Pequot village at Mystic. They attacked before sunrise. What followed wasn't battle, it was annihilation. They set the village ablaze. And when the fire didn't kill fast enough, they used muskets, swords, hatchets. Men, women, Children, gone. Some tried to flee into the forest. They were hunted down. Others surrendered. They were enslaved, shipped off to the Caribbean, stripped of identity. In one day, a nation was nearly erased. The English declared the Pequot extinct. Their name was banned. Their language forbidden. Their survivors scattered. The river that once carried their canoes, now carried their ashes. And for the Mohegan, who had sided with the colonists, the aftermath was complicated. They had helped destroy an enemy, but watched their world shrink under the same foreign rule. What do you do when your survival depends on your silence? The Mohegan kept their identity alive in whispers, in secret ceremonies, in names passed down quietly through generations, because they knew the river remembers. Even if the maps forgot, even if the history books wrote them out, the river remembered. It remembered the sacred dances at the water's edge, the first laughter of children fishing on the rocks, the morning songs echoing after the fire. It remembered the truth, that this land, long before it was called Connecticut, was never empty. It was full of language, spirit, and story. Today, descendants of the Mohegan and Pequot still walk this land, still fight for recognition, still protect what remains. Their nations have been rebuilt, not from stone, but from story, and from blood that refused to disappear. Say the name, Connecticut, and you speak the word of their river, their home. You echo a legacy of survival. But what followed this chapter was not healing. Because once the river had been honored, and then desecrated, it was turned into something else entirely. A line of ownership, a path of expansion, a tool of war. And the price of that transformation would be written in fire. A line etched in fire, claimed not by memory, but by musket and decree. After the smoke of Mystic cleared, after the screams faded into the hills, Connecticut's future was no longer being written in native tongues, but in colonial ink. The English had taken the river. Its tides, once sacred, now served a different rhythm. The rhythm of conquest. In the aftermath of the Pequot War, the message was clear. This was no longer a place of shared ground. It was a possession. Land was parceled. Wampum became currency. And the river, the lifeblood of centuries, became a highway for expansion. But there was no peace, only order. An order built on the silence of those who had once sung here. An order that demanded allegiance, obedience, and surrender. In 1639, the colonies of Windsor, Wethersfield, and Hartford formalized their unity under the Fundamental Orders, a framework of governance that some call the first written constitution in the Western world. But beneath that proud declaration lay blood, still drying beneath the roots of charred villages, still staining the edges of the long river. And yet, even in the early years of Connecticut's colonial birth, fear lingered. Because those who rule by force are haunted by what they've taken. The colonists fortified their towns, built watchtowers, and carried muskets to Sunday sermons. They spoke of civilization, while living in the shadow of what they had destroyed. The river that had once been a symbol of unity, now divided. Not just people from people, but past from present. Its banks bore witness to a transformation. One where the spiritual gave way to the strategic. Where the sacred was paved over by the practical. Settlements grew. Wethersfield, Saybrook, New Haven. Each one a nail driven deeper into the earth, staking claim, rewriting story. By the mid-1600s, Connecticut had become more than a collection of towns. It was a colony with ambition. Trade routes expanded. Shipbuilding thrived. The river was tamed, dredged, bridged, controlled. But the land itself had not forgotten. Storms came. Floods swallowed crops. Diseases returned. Some called it bad luck. Others knew better. There's a price to changing the purpose of a river. A cost to forgetting who named it first. Still, the settlers pressed on. In 1662, Connecticut received its royal charter from King Charles II. It was a moment of triumph, legal recognition from the crown itself. The colony now stretched from the Narragansett Bay to the Pacific Ocean, at least on paper. And yet, beneath that charter, the names of entire nations were missing. Erased. Unacknowledged. The Pequot. The Mohegan. The Nipmuc. The tunxus. Not footnotes in a grand story. But foundations, cracked, but still holding up the truth. Because the truth was never burned away. It lived in the stories mothers told their children in secret. In the small clearings where ceremonies still took place beneath the moon. In the eyes of a people who had every reason to disappear, but didn't. Back in the colonial towns, the English boasted of law, of liberty, of providence. They spoke of a promised land. A city on a hill. But how do you build liberty on land taken without consent? How do you preach providence with the ashes of another people in your hands? By the late 1600s, Connecticut had become one of the most stable English colonies in New England. Its river bustled with commerce, grain, livestock, timber. Its towns grew orderly, disciplined, righteous. But the cost had been paid in lives. In silence. In stories buried beneath brick and stone. And still, the river watched. It watched as the children of colonists played on the banks they claimed as their own. It watched as sermons echoed from wooden churches that stood where longhouses once stood. It watched as history was written and rewritten to favor the victors. But water doesn't lie. It remembers, and beneath the surface, it still carries the truth. It carries the names that were nearly forgotten, the songs nearly lost, the pain nearly erased, because even as Connecticut grew prosperous, it carried within it a wound, one disguised as progress, one rooted in forgetting. And yet, not everyone forgot. Not everyone turned away. Some remembered the stories told by firelight. Some listened to the wind as it moved through the reeds. Some stood beside the river, not to claim it, but to understand it. Because the river, even after all the war, the blood, the treaties broken and land taken, still flows. And it carries not just water, but memory. The memory of a people. The memory of a promise. The memory of a name. Quinnehtukqut. Not a victory. Not a possession. But a sacred connection. A reminder that this state, like its river, was never meant to be owned. Only honored, only remembered. And in time, Connecticut would begin to remember, not just what it had become, but what it had once been. And in time, Connecticut would begin to remember. Not just what it had become, but what it had once been. From the ashes of war and the silence of erasure, a colony grew. And that colony, slowly, stubbornly, transformed into something more. By the late 1600s, Connecticut was no longer just a scattering of fortified towns. It was a living organism. Built on trade, law, belief, and contradiction. The river became the colony's spine, guiding commerce, moving goods, shaping settlements. On its banks, shipbuilders carved the skeletons of vessels that would cross oceans. Farmers tilled the rich floodplain soil. Merchants opened ledgers. Children learned to read by candlelight. In 1701, a college was founded in Saybrook before moving to New Haven. They called it Yale. And it would one day shape presidents, poets, and power brokers. But even as Connecticut embraced learning and liberty, it bore the weight of its beginnings. It was a place of proud declarations, of self-governance, of religious freedom, of colonial strength. Yet, it stood on land taken by force. Its fields grew green from soil once soaked in blood. Still, the identity of Connecticut evolved. Through the 18th century, it became known as the land of steady habits, a place of order, discipline, hard work. Its citizens valued modesty and independence. They built meeting houses instead of mansions. They trusted their town halls more than kings. And when revolution stirred in Boston and Philadelphia, Connecticut didn't stand still. Its people took up arms, melted church bells into cannonballs, carried the cry of freedom across the river that once carried war. In the fires of the American Revolution, a new kind of identity was forged. Not just colonial, but American. And when independence was won, Connecticut stepped forward not as a footnote, but as a founder. In 1788, it became the fifth state to ratify the U.S. Constitution. And from that moment on, the name, Connecticut, wasn't just a colonial claim. It was a cornerstone in a new nation. Yet through it all, the river remained, flowing through history like a witness, carrying whispers from both past and present. Because no matter how many roads were paved, no matter how many boundaries were drawn, The soul of Connecticut was still tied to that long, tidal river, to Quinnehtukqut. The name we say without thinking, but that once meant something sacred. Something deeper than lines on a map. A place beside the water. A place where memory and mist are never far apart. And though the name survived, the stories buried beneath it were still waiting to be heard. Today, we say, Connecticut, as if it's just a name, but it was never just a name. It was Quinnehtukqut, beside the long tidal river, a word spoken long before the first colony. A memory carried on the wind, through the trees, across the water. This land was not born of borders or charters. It was shaped by those who walked it first. The Mohegan, the Pequot. The river was their lifeline. Their story, their home. And though war tried to silence them, though colonists tried to erase them, the river remembers. It remembers the songs, the smoke, the sorrow. It remembers the names that history tried to forget. And maybe, so should we, because when we speak the name, Connecticut, we're echoing a language older than this nation, a voice that still lives beneath our feet. So the next time you see the river, or read the word etched on a sign or a license plate, ask yourself, whose story are we standing on? And whose voice are we still learning to hear? Like the river, we must carry memory forward. Don't just remember the name, remember what it means.